Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, everyone, panelists and attendees for joining Localis's second Building for Renewal webinar of this year, Cultivating Garden Cities. I'm Jonathan Warren, Chief Executive for Localis, and really what we're trying to do with these series of housing webinars is to explore some of the key issues facing housing and planning at the present moment. Garden cities, from their inception, from the days of Ebeneezer Howard, good to see you, Toby, they have always had that sheen of utopia, that combination, that ideal mix of rural and urban. And really, I think we've assembled a top panel today to debate how they might fit in the current housing and planning context, and especially given the desire to build back better in the light of COVID. How fit for purpose is the garden community's, garden cities agenda for the present day, and what are some of the financial, regulatory and other obstacles and challenges which we well-minded to overcome for this? So in terms of our panel, we have Sir Paul Carter, fantastic Localis board member, formerly leader of Kent County Council, former chair of the County Councils Network, and Paul has written his first book on public service reform. I was very intrigued to learn this morning. Also joined by Toby Lloyd, former number 10 housing advisor, former director of policy for Shelter, Stephen Howell, head of investments at MHCLG, and probably most famously known as for your time at Localis. Joke there, Stephen. And lastly, Ian Tasker, Director at Grant Thornton. So we've got a top panel to debate the issues. What we're going to do, as with all our Localis housing webinars, I'm going to invite the panelists to basically set out their views and thoughts on where the agenda for Garden City sits at the current moment. Give you, say, 3 to 5 minutes each, guys, to share your views, what's most important, and then for the fun of the attendees, the Q&A box comes alive. When you putting your questions in, use the Q&A box rather than the chat box, so I will be looking at both, and we will then, in Mrs. Merton fashion, have a heated debate on garden cities. So the running order today, I'm going to ask in this order: Toby, then Paul, then Ian, and then Stephen. If you'd be so good, Toby, to kick us off, please. Thank you. If I could ask you to unmute.
As is traditional, always good to start a Zoom seminar with an unmuting fiasco. Yeah, good to see you all, and welcome to the particularly dingy corner of my bedroom. Garden cities is an issue and a movement that I've been involved in for many years in different guises, and after both as a policy practitioner and in government, and as a speculative entrant to the Wolfson Prize, Economics Prize in 2014, where we actually proposed our own garden city in the Hoop Peninsula, which some of you probably remember. I didn't manage to win it, but yeah, we had a good run, and it was extremely interesting process. What I've ultimately concluded though about garden cities is that they are the worst possible solution to the housing crisis, apart from all of the other ones. So we always find ourselves coming back to this idea and this program, and there's some great stuff happening out there, despite the many limitations of the concept. They are fundamentally because the fundamental reasons for garden cities, I think, are threefold. Firstly, what they were originally about, which was design. It was basically about making better quality places than otherwise existed. And it is still true that many of our residential neighbourhoods and our towns and our cities are pretty poor quality. They need better public services, they need better quality housing, they need better street design, particularly better public realm, more parks. There's all sorts of things that could be improved about the designs of the settlements that we currently live in. However, it is still questionable whether the right solution is therefore to design whole new ones from scratch. Would it not be better to work with the many existing settlements we have? The eventual winners of the Wolfson Prize in 2014 made this point very clearly when they said, you can't build a new city. You literally cannot build a new city. It takes 1,000 years to make a city. If the most successful and largest of the new towns that we've built in the last 200 years is Milton Keynes, And even that, I think most people would struggle to say is a really kind of proper, thriving, excellent city. I know some people love it, many people don't. Either way, I think, the Urbed winners of the 2014 Wolfson Prize pointed out England particularly has a huge number of very good quality cities that are far too small, right? That have a university, an ancient cathedral, a huge amount of history, a fantastic kind of sense of place. They just don't house very many people. Surely we'll be better off actually expanding the existing cities we have. And they make a very good case for that. And they use the example of Oxford, but they pointed out about 100 smaller towns and cities around the country that could very easily be expanded. But the second reason for garden cities has always been about the economics. And I think that's the point that we still get stuck on, and that's why we keep coming back to brand new settlements. It turns out it's just too damn difficult to build or to expand our existing cities or to improve our existing cities effectively. And that's why I still come back to garden cities as a positive solution, because they're not only often a more practical way of increasing housing supply and quality, but critically they overcome the fundamental, they offer the potential, I should say, to overcome the fundamental problem of housing supply, which is land value. Anywhere that is already an existing city that is prime location for redevelopment, for new housing, for increased housing, the land market will have got there before you, and the value will have been sucked out long before you turn up with your fancy plans and your nice proposals for new parks and infrastructure. However much public money you pour in will inevitably be sucked out before you've even started, because that's the nature of the land market and always has been. This isn't a problem with the planning system. The planning system was created to try and deal with this problem. It doesn't do so very adequately, but it's not created by planning. It's the other way around. We've always had this problem and we always will. It's inherent in the nature of land itself because you can't move it anywhere. It just is where it is and its supply is fixed. So the reason we come back to garden cities is simply because when you have essentially a blank piece of paper, you can make that case much more clearly. You can make the case much more transparently and say, this city, this new settlement would not exist unless we collectively decide to make it happen. It's going to cost a lot of money. Therefore, it is surely right that the value created in the process goes towards supporting the public goods. We cannot just say, we're going to plonk a new garden city on this farm, therefore this farm goes from being worth £1 million to being worth £10 billion. And that value is just automatically given to the person who happens to own it. That would clearly be nonsense. We need that value to fund the city itself. Except that is exactly what does happen. Most housing development suffers from exactly that problem. The value is creamed out through the land market. The lion's share of the reward goes to the landowner, whether or not they have spent years battling the system and trying to get a fantastic new development built, or they just happen to get lucky. Either way, the money is creamed off through the land value system. And we end up back where we started with unsustainable development, inadequate housing supply. The homes have to be inordinately expensive to try and make everything break even. There's never enough left over for all the good things that make cities beautiful and sustainable and attractive places to live in. And we end up exactly where we've always been. So we come back to garden cities mainly because it offers the potential to solve this fundamental flaw in the way we organise the economics of housing supply. Sadly, even our Garden Cities programme often fails to do that, and there's plenty of examples of where it just hasn't quite lived up to that aspiration. However, it still remains, unfortunately, our best hope of overcoming the land value problem. So, garden cities, here we come.
Toby, many thanks for getting us underway in such a strong-spirited, thoughtful fashion. For those following on Twitter, must say the hashtag today is #GardenCities. Initial caps, if you'd be so good to include that in your social media commentary. So Paul Carter, you're up next. From your great experience in developing running a major local authority, how do you see the garden cities playing out?
Well, if I just start by correcting you, I didn't say I'd written a book on public sector reform. I've written a paper about 22 pages long on public sector reform, which looks at the need for planning reform, which I'll touch on because it's relevant to garden cities, skills and training, and health and social care integration and health reform. So they're the major subject areas. But I mean, I've been involved in the construction industry for many years, doing a lot of modest regeneration programs in West London. Most of my life. So I know about the construction industry and the personal experience and scars from the planning processes that I've endured with various London boroughs over the years. But more specifically, my experience as leader of Kent County Council and a senior member of KCC for some 24, 25 years, I've been very heavily involved in the Ebbsfleet Garden City at Ebbsfleet. The build out of Kings Hill, which is not a garden city, but a new community of some size, about 15,000 homes will be approaching shortly from a greenfield site or brownfield site, formerly an RAF airfield, which has been a phenomenal success. And the evolution of the plans for the new township on the edge of Folkestone, adjacent to the high-speed 1 railway line, where the station's already built but yet never been used. But I'm a great supporter of new towns, garden cities, new villages and new communities, because many of our townships in Kent have been expanded to their capacity, more urban sprawl on top of urban sprawl. And frankly, it's beginning because the infrastructure, point Toby made, is creaking, and without massive investment, they've reached their critical mass. Some towns haven't, some villages haven't, and there is room for growth of those villages, but we have, through the planning policies and local plans, a tendency to superimpose more growth on those communities that already experienced more growth than is their fair share, and we're beginning to diminish the quality of life in those communities. So the opportunity to find appropriate land close wherever possible to the rail network and the road network must be the right thing to do. But I would agree with Toby, don't underestimate the difficulty that you have in getting underway, the land assembly through the planning process, and the extraordinary cost of the infrastructure that's needed to support that community. When you looked at Kings Hill, for an example, I did a sort of rough and ready check of the land that was acquired by Kent County Council in partnership with Rouse Construction, who then became Liberty. The profits that we've seen as a 50% shareholder, KCC with Liberty, have we actually, if we'd started with no government subsidy, no government grants to build bypasses and schools, etc., would it have broken even? And the answer is yes, it would, but only just. And that land was acquired at a very nominal price. So I think there's a significant issue there. I think another major issue, again, the issue that Toby made, is the land value. And in my short document that I'll be publishing shortly, it looks about the need to reform the Land Compensation Act of, I think, 1974, where if there's a public need for that land to be acquired and change the CPO rules, why should you not be able to compulsorily purchase the land for suitable locations for new communities, new towns, garden cities, at double the value of agricultural land value, and get the public agencies to lead in the development of those much needed homes on those new land. And the land assembly should be, I think, a role of the public sector to deliver at a sensible price, which gives the original landowner a good return on over and above agricultural land, and get on and do. And I think that the public sector has a big role to play. The problems we had at Ebbsfleet with land securities, where big 106 agreements were agreed before as part of the planning process. But again, those developer contributions, not nearly enough to make that site viable, because it was being built in a quarry and had all sorts of associated difficulties. So I would like to see, as you can hear from me, many more new communities appearing, accepting that there needs to be a balance of growing existing villages and communities, where some villages can grow more than they currently are, and the NIMBYs tend to rule and the parish councils rule, where you've got villages that aren't big enough to sustain a village school or a village shop, or in some cases even a village pub. So I'm balanced between the two, but if we're to deliver the housing growth that this country needs and catch up in the lag between population growth and houses actually that have come out of the ground over the last 10 years, we need to look to completely new communities being set up across the counties, and most importantly, appropriately placed. Because one thing that I have seen, particularly from Folkestone, that generally new towns, new communities are pretty popular with the local populace. You don't get the same extent of NIMBYism as you do when you're building a significant housing development as further urban sprawl without the necessary investment in infrastructure, which has been the case so many times across the southeast of England.
Many thanks indeed, Paul. And yes, we'll clarify, a pamphlet, not a book.
Correct.
Next up, Ian Tasker, Director, Grant Thornton. Very keen to get your views on development, build out of garden cities from your experience. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'll touch upon some of the financing aspects we're seeing from the garden communities. I think, since the start of the Garden Communities Initiative, we've seen the market respond positively to the government's ask of developers, funders, both public and private, and local authorities, to ultimately tackle the issue, as Toby's put, of delivering affordable and quality places to live. However, when you're looking at whether it's a garden town or a village, it really goes without saying there's going to be financial challenges along the way. As advisor to some of these schemes, we've seen the testing of both the stewardship model, generally under locally led development corporation initiatives, as well as alternative delivery models such as public-private partnerships. However, what we've seen is the choice of the delivery model has often been underpinned by questions of financial viability. And as Sir Paul and Toby have touched upon, land value and upfront infrastructure investment are key determinants in that financial viability assessment. And what we're seeing is that the sheer level of initial infrastructure investment requires a significant long-term commitment, and therefore private capital, often with a requirement to attach to a strong covenant strength, private capital on its own may not be sufficient. But what we're also seeing, the market respond, is that with the financial challenges, often comes innovation. So we are seeing the market respond with innovative ways of structuring the finance, sharing the risk and reward, and that's ultimately with a common aim of delivering affordable and quality places to live. But fundamentally, as with any large-scale development, it's the financial viability is often the key determinant and challenge is what we're seeing in whether we can actually make a scheme viable or not.
Many thanks, Ian, for your views on those, stressing sort of the financial aspect of all this. So, brings me now to our final speaker for initial comments, Stephen Howe, ex-Localist, now happily ensconced in your, what looks like your conservatory. It's MHCLG. If I could ask you to unmute and spiel the way, please, Stephen.
Yes, this is the new MHCLG Towers, version 3, I think, of MHCLG Towers, for those of you with long enough memories. I won't call it the Orangery, despite the Orangery. So thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me, and to you two panelists who we know well from projects past. I will just do a little bit, excuse the classic civil servant lines of garden communities. I'll just remind people a little bit about the project, and then think about the future. So it's been, I think, just a bit over 6 years since we launched the Garden Communities programme in its sort of current guise, but of course the legacy is far longer than that. It's easy to forget I think those with a look at the sort of modern planning and sort of development system, that this country has a history of new towns and Garden communities principles. It's perhaps it's more in recent times is the oddity of not seeing that being the norm. We've given out over sort of 40 million pounds, I think, of capacity funding over the years to a range of projects across the country. We're now at 49 sort of garden communities, I think 50 if you include Ebbsfleet, with this sort of potential for 350,000, circa up to 350,000 homes, which is not insubstantial number of homes. But of course, we have long since sort of hung our hats on this not just being about numbers, it's about the qualities and the sorts of principles that we would like to see, up and down the country with those local authority-led developments. There's been a few things published in recent months and years that have sort of taken a bit of a knock at these sort of projects. But I think, as a rule, we are sort of pleased with the progress that we've made. We're pleased with what is coming forward. If we think of the sort of the custom and sort of self-build sort of pioneer at Bicester, the sort of quality that's being proposed, places like Westcar Clays, the sort of sustainability approaches that and the sort of modal shift stuff that's sort of planned at Harlow, the sort of the net zero carbon stuff that we're seeing in Chelmsford, and actually I think is already being piloted in parts of Northamptonshire. So wherever if you look across the programme, you can see examples there of what we'd like to be more widespread across the country. And I sort of, as ministers have in the past, we commend the ambition of those local authorities that have sort of joined us and that have sort of taken that sort of often tough political call to sort of really back and go for growth. So I think we just need to, this stuff, as we all know, it's not easy. We're here to try and make it easier, and I think it's we shouldn't lose sight of and the progress that particularly local authorities have made in difficult circumstances, of course, particularly at the moment with COVID-19. Just sort of looking ahead and sort of reflecting on what panelists have said about the future and what's needed, and obviously I expect we'll go into this more in the Q&A. I'll start with planning. Maybe Toby will tell me we shouldn't start with planning. We should start far earlier than planning, and of course he's right. But I will start with planning, and I think it's just worth saying that the planning reforms that the government has proposed, clearly are significant, and I think just give us an opportunity to really sort of look at that sort of life cycle of a garden community, of a garden city, and give us an opportunity to sort of look and review and make sure that we consider any implications from recent examinations. I think that's something we want to look at as we go through that process. It will and it will be a process over time. Funding, I think, government has been clear that the garden cities, garden communities are an essential part of sort of meeting our housing objectives, of meeting our country's growth objectives, building back better, etc. And that these are not, particularly when we're getting up to the higher end in terms of scale, these are not your run-of-the-mill projects. Places will need help and support. Ian was talking about private sector capital, private investment. I mean, we are clearly very interested in that. Perhaps we'll talk further, Ian, about that. I'm sure in due course. So that is clearly of strong interest to government. But at the same time, you know, we have invested as a government through the Housing Infrastructure Fund, a number of, you know, garden communities or even places not on the garden communities programme, you know, have benefited from the Housing Infrastructure Fund. We had new announced, you know, 7.1 billion reconfirmed at the spending review for the National Home Building Fund. There's going to be more, Treasury confirmed there'll be more funding at the next spending review. So, you know, government is willing to put in the public sector investment to alongside that, you know, maximising the private sector investment. So I think, you know, more, you know, watch this space for future funding. Expertise, and here I'm really, you know, I've clearly expertise in terms of local authorities and people like Ian and Toby, but I'm thinking here really of sort of Homes England, the role that Homes England plays, continues to play in terms of supporting, you know, places on the programme, advising and you know, holding, you know, really sort of being that sort of centre of excellence for the sort of expertise to help bring these projects forward, and will continue to do so. And I think then, I mean, really the thing that we really need is a pipeline of projects. We need places to, despite, you know, the challenges that the country is facing, we need places to be coming forward with projects. We need them to be talking to Homes England, probably in the first instance, about new proposals, about, you know, how they want to shape, you know, growth in their areas, and of course the quality that we, you know, would like to see in those areas. So I think I'd probably just end on that, and a sort of a plea to continue sort of bringing those projects forward, and look forward to discussions with places in the future.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very much. Thanks also to Toby, Paul, and Ian for getting us off to a good start in really setting out the scale of the challenges and what's at stake, what the potential could be from garden cities where we are now. So got the Q&A box open, quite a bit coming through the chat already, not all of it necessarily from friends in North Essex, but let's take a sort of broader question on the role of communities. We had earlier in our series a very lively, very strongly contended debate on the role of community in planning for the future, with Andy from Bradski from MHCLG, Victoria Hills et al. Clearly, this is raising a lot of necessary personal passions about developments in place, what this means for existing communities, providing necessary infrastructure, what this looks like in place. Any thoughts about what might be good at forging a strong and clear sense of community and place identity in the way that brings existing residents where you're building on to something new? Or is this why the argument being made earlier that if you're looking at garden communities, somewhere completely new and unbuilt is always the best option? Any thoughts and views about community making as well as place making?
Yeah, I'd happily.
Thank you.
When we did our Wolfson Prize proposal for a new garden city in Medway, which, you know, hold my hands up, we had not, you know, it was an essay competition, and I wouldn't claim it was the right location in planning terms. It was, you know, a place chosen as an illustration. But we did do a lot of consultation and focus grouping and kind of real deliberative discussion with local people, both kind of the hyper local people directly affected by the site, and more important, and people from the wider area. And we learned a lot about actually what makes new settlements acceptable. And the truth is, there's almost nothing you can do to make a new settlement acceptable to the people who are very, very directly affected. And, you know, fair enough, right? If you live in a tiny village in the middle of the countryside, and suddenly, you know, everything around you is about to be turned into a building site for 20 years, it's very hard to say, oh, you know, if we make it a really nice school, will that change your attitude? It's just not. You've really disrupted people's lives, and we have to recognise that, and we have to acknowledge that that has costs, for very real costs for those people. But it is also important to recognise that the local community is bigger than just the people who are affected immediately, and public policy is constantly full of these difficult trade-offs between small numbers and large numbers of people and the extremity of their opposition stroke support. And what we found when we talked to people in the wider community around Medway is that there was huge appetite for more affordable housing and for better services. And just by asking people, actually, what did you want most? Turned out, I would never have guessed this. I would have thought, schools, hospitals, whatever. It was a better supermarket. Right? It was actually, just a decent supermarket was really lacking. So, by suggesting actually, well, how about we actually listen to what local people want and prioritize those things first, because the sequencing is really important. The private sector financial viability demands always push for the high value things quickly, and then we'll kind of worry about the infrastructure later on when the population's really at max and the local infrastructure is at breaking point. If you reverse that sequence and you provide the supermarket and the school and the nice things right up front, you really can make a big difference to people. Now, of course, that hits the bottom line and that does have subsidy implications, and then you get back to the problem of land value again. But it was very clear from our consultation that actually lots of local people can really be brought on board if you listen to what they want and get the sequencing right. And unfortunately, we generally don't do that.
Many thanks, Toby. Paul, very keen to get your views from a local authority leader's perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I can only talk from sort of the experience we've had from the Ebbsfleet development to the Development Corporation, but particularly a more recent in Otterpool. I remember some of the submissions from Medway on the Wolfson Prize project, where I think Medway came second, and I know that area particularly well, but particularly on Otterpool. You've really got to set out your stall to the community and talk up the advantages. I mean, Folkestone is a coastal town that has suffered from significant deprivation, but has the most enormous potential. And Otterpool is away from Folkestone, but pretty close to it. And obviously, there have been small rural communities nearer the village that have had some negativity to it. But generally, when you talk of the advantages of employment opportunities to Folkestone for a whole new community, which will predominantly probably be the down from Londoners who can get into London in 30-35 minutes. If you've got a good master plan, you've got the land assembly, and you can really talk up the benefits to the local economy in bringing prosperity out of London, and those families will settle and their kids will go to school and they'll be part of the general and broad community. The benefits are enormous because Folkestone is on the up, but it's taking a very slow burn and a lot of time to get there. I do think that it's important that the land assembly is done through development corporations. The big problem we had at Ebbsfleet was that I was a member of the development corporation at its instigation was that it didn't control the land. If the development corporation doesn't have ownership or control over the land, it makes things exceedingly difficult. But in fact, again, coming back to Otterpool, that predominantly now is the land is either optioned or owned by Folkestone and Hythe Council, and they've got brave plans, and it's going very well. But it's taking a long time. If you ask now, from 2-3 years in for it beginning to gain traction, when the first significant houses will be built on site, I fear it's still probably 3-4 years ago away from getting the first house under construction or built.
Many thanks, Paul. Stephen.
Well spotted, Jonathan. To echo both of those points, as Paul has said. Sitting in MHCLG, often we forgot to mention, but it's very much in our sort of hearts and minds, as the economic, the job opportunities, the economic growth possibilities, of housing. We're not just about building boxes. Just as important, maybe even more important, is the jobs that go with it. So Paul is absolutely right. That is critical in terms of selling the benefits, particularly in those places which are further away from those economic centres. Equally, to echo what Toby was saying, one of the more famous house builders of recent times, now sadly departed, was a past master of knowing what a community really wants. What is it that will secure their sport? And I think you're absolutely right, Toby. That is not always obvious. It is very bespoke. It is very local, and indeed that that is why our programme and indeed government as a whole is all about subsidiarity and local decision making, because we think you're closer to what really makes local people tick, and that is, as Toby said, that is super critical in terms of building that community sport as best you can.
Thanks, Stephen. And finally, Ian.
Yeah, I want to pick up with Toby's point about the need to put some infrastructure and social infrastructure at the front end. Now, I'm an advocate of development corporations, and in particular the new model of locally led development corporations, and there's various guises we're seeing. So the concept of those, which is great from my perspective, is that there's an element of local democracy there. So you actually have local authorities that are able to influence the development corporation in terms of putting in the upfront infrastructure, putting in the upfront social infrastructure through a single delivery vehicle. So I think that helps in that regard. Likewise, those development corporations are attractive vehicles to bring in private capital, but on their own, the locally led development corporations aren't the answer. They do need the skills of the private sector to actually undertake the actual development, and it needs that skills and that expertise as well. So there's definitely a place for both in my mind, and potentially with the locally led development corporations, through local democracy, doing some of the heavy lifting in terms of putting in place the long-term infrastructure, and then working with the private sector in terms of the housing delivery itself.
Sorry, can I just come on this point about the public versus private sector? Because I think we're in danger of kind of pitting the two against each other as fundamentally different, and that some things sit in one place and some things sit in the other. Skills don't sit in the private sector or the public sector; they sit in people. People work for public sector organisations, private sector organisations, third sector organisations. Any organisation should, in theory, be able to hire the skills necessary. There's nothing inherently public or private about those skills. Now, we've moved from a world in which the majority of architects used to work for public bodies to a world in which almost no architects work for public bodies. Right? These are choices, right? They can all change. The key thing when it comes to actually building places, and particularly if you're building whole new settlements, garden communities, garden cities, is not actually whether it's public or private or voluntary. And actually, over our history, we've seen some fantastic places built by all three. The key thing, and when I was at Shelter, we did a lot of work on this when we were exploring what we called the new civic house building. We looked at places like Bath, built by the private sector, purely speculatively. We looked at Letchworth Garden City, built by the third sector, charities, and we looked at the new towns built by the public sector. The ones that work always have the same thing in common, regardless of whether it's public, private, or voluntary, is that they have the public interest is their primary motivation. Right? They're not there to make a speculative profit. And as soon as you allow that speculative profit motive to come in, and by the way, public sector can behave just the same, so can the third sector. It's not just a private sector problem. But as soon as that as soon as that speculative profit motive creeps into your incentive structure, you basically fatally undermine the ability of any organisation to effectively deliver a really high quality place and bring people with it and make them affordable at the end of the day. So it's not whether it's public or private, it's what the fundamental motivation is.
And Toby, I think we're in danger of violently agreeing on that, because certainly I think the whole model of public versus private just doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And certainly it's a case of them both working together now. Locally led development corporations, I think, is a good vehicle to allow that to happen at various levels. And one of the advantages I think that has is in terms of the attractiveness to the financial community of that statutory vehicle versus the more traditional local asset-backed vehicles, the traditional PPP companies that are out there. So yeah, I agree. It's a combination of both with a common goal and common aspiration.
I mean, it's got to be a public-private partnership, and both sides can make a profit on this if they go about it in the right way. And sometimes the private sector can do it without the involvement of the public sector, as was referred to the late and much-loved Tony Pidgley, who's done some extraordinary developments and created that enormous sense of community, and he's done it with the help and support of the London Borough Council in that area. What particular case in point that I'm referring to has been a great success. But so often, more often than not, the private sector can tend to make the promises and then not deliver. And when you look at the number of significant communities that have been built across the southeast, where they promised an open community space, and actually at the end of the day, they've wrung the neck out of the profit and not delivered the original master plan that was approved by the determining planning authority, which gives the private sector a bad name. But you know, I've worked in both and combined my career with being a leading councillor in Kent, and there can be good and bad on both sides. But if you get it right and the right people, there I do agree with Toby, irrespective of whether they're from the private sector or the public sector, working together as a team, you can do extraordinary things. And just think what the Victorians built in such a short order, how they did it, I've no idea. But where there's a will, there's a way.
Many thanks, Paul. Now I'm going to delve into pick and mix, which is the Q&A box. Have to level with you folks. We're not going to answer all the questions within the next 20 minutes or so, but please feed into us. We will get you answers as and when. I've got a direct one for you first, Stephen, does government recognise the financial scale of investment required to make a large new settlement succeed, to deliver the infrastructure, truly affordable homes and green space promises? Does it need billions and not just a few million for feasibility studies? Quick response to that would be grateful.
The easy one first. The short answer is no, I don't agree that it does need billions of pounds. These are £billion investments, but I think that doesn't necessarily require billions of pounds to be put in from the public sector, as the panel has just stated. And it's worth saying that obviously government has backed, as I said at the start, government has backed not in hundreds of millions of pounds for some of these places. I think there's a lot of thinking to do about the numbers behind this, and clearly more work to be done in that space.
I mean, I just, the point I made, it depends what cost the land comes in at. And that's why, the compulsory purchase order and the Land Compensation Act needs to act where there is sensible locations for new garden communities to be built. But, when agricultural land's worth £10,000 an acre, and land in parts of Kent, residential land in parts of Kent in the west of the county is exchanging hands for over £2.5 million an acre, you're not going to be able to afford to see viability in new communities if you're going to have to pay that land value. I did say double the price of agriculture. If it was 10 times the price of agricultural land, you'd be getting the land in at £100,000 an acre, and it would make things so much more viable. But, as we've said before, this is a long-term investment. New communities don't come out the ground in 2 or 3 years. This is over 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And therefore, you need to have patient investors through it. But I do believe as well, through the development corporations in partnership with the private sector, you've got to run open book accounting, and you've got to cost from the outset the master plan, or what the roads are going to cost, maybe in some cases bigger communities, hospitals, GP hubs, the whole list of those community infrastructure that's needed to be provided should not be underestimated. And I think the government does underestimate how much pump priming they need to make to get even the smaller garden communities underway, let alone the big ones. And this is a long-term investment where you've got to have long-term certainty of government support, which is with our parliamentary system quite difficult to crack.
Thank you very much.
Just to pick up on one final point, if I may, Jonathan. I think Paul, you're absolutely right. I mean, long term, long term is the key, isn't it? We need to be in the long run. I mean, on the pump priming stuff, I mean, I think at least part, depending on where these things go, I think at least part of the problem is cash flow. and long-term support. And that's, always happy to hear ideas and suggestions on how we might do better on that front.
Many thanks, Stephen. Paul, very quick topical one for you. Housing Minister today has announced Simon Dudley as the new chair of Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. Is he going to bring the scheme to fruition, do you reckon?
Well, I mean, Ebbsfleet had a very slow burn to begin with, but you go there year after year and not see a lot happening. But now it really has accelerated its pace. It's nothing like the original master plan, I might add, that was originally granted consent, but it's accelerating. I mean, the potential there is still vast. I mean, that will go on being developed, I suspect, even with accelerating the pace from where it is now, another 15, 20 years to grow to its capacity, because there's, it's a large land tract of brownfield land there, all the way out to the Thames itself, and massive potential. I don't know Simon Dudley. I'll have to look him up, and hopefully he can be the driving force behind it. But the first chairman's done a very reasonable job in getting things underway, but it comes back to that problem. If you haven't got the land assembly sorted out and you don't own the land, it's much more difficult if you haven't got a willing seller to develop to its full potential.
And this also goes back to the one of the problems here, which has always bedeviled, or certainly in my experience, has bedeviled the garden communities, garden cities movement, which is one of branding. Is if you just go around labelling every car park a garden city, all you do is undermine the quality of the garden city brand in the first place. And Ebbsfleet is a tragic example of that. It's a fantastic location. It should be an amazing project, but it's got something like 60,000 car parking spaces it's legally obligated to provide to service Blue Water and the international train station, and it doesn't own the land. The development corporation that doesn't own the land is just not only ruining the brand of garden cities, it's ruining the brand and the concept of development corporations as well. So we do need to, rather than lambast people for kind of failure, point out that they just have not been given even the most basic tools you need to make a success of that place. And they're doing their best, and all power to them, but they just do not have the tools or the firepower to really do the job properly.
Thank you, Toby. So taking two questions at once, one from John Beasley asking about pace and scale. Can we combine townscapes and infrastructure? And really quite good one from Juliet Blackburn. The garden cities, fairly or unfairly, seen as more of a province of the southeast. She's citing an example from Birkenhead and the Renewal, where there's a scheme for 20,000 new homes in a well-connected community sited across from the Liverpool waterfront. She asks, given a broken property market in Birkenhead, is there any advice colleagues could give as to meeting challenges of scale for new developments where you've got difficulties with the property market? Any top tips or suggestions?
I mean, if I can come in, having been a property developer for most of my career, I've always tended towards residential investment rather than commercial investment because of the demand side. People in this country with a growing population will always need a decent roof over their head, and that's where the shortage is. So the demand side is there in Birkenhead as well as in the rest of England. And therefore, to get patient institutional investors into this for the long term, we've had housing recessions, prices have gone up, they've gone down. But if you look at the capital growth actually over the period, and that can be for both social housing, where many of the housing associations are not making a bad return on their investment with current housing benefit levels. The business case there, provided it's in an area where people want to settle and want to live, and the infrastructure, particularly the transport infrastructure through rail and roads, is good, we ought to be able to accelerate the pace and get people excited. It comes back, I want to repeat again, the cost of the land acquisition and the control of that site for development corporations. But if the government can give more longer term certainty and have a master plan that's well costed and well structured over a 20-year horizon, I think you can get that partnership between the private sector and the public sector and with house builders and the utilisation of vast amounts of institutional money, if they can get a safe return on their investment, they'll write out the cheques, I have no doubt.
Anyone else want to throw? I
mean, I'll just say just exactly what Juliet has suggested. I focus on quality, especially if you're talking about places where there's a relatively, the economic value is inherently lower just because there is less demand for economic investment in places like Birkenhead than in places in the southeast. It's all the more important that you don't allow kind of corner cutting to cut costs and build it on the cheap. It is the quality of new places that will make them stand out and will make them work socially, environmentally, and therefore work economically in the long run. But that is a long-term game. It just is. There's no way you're going to get your money back quickly. I mean, Paul says 20 years. Even that's a stretch, to be honest, for large-scale private sector investment in a place like Birkenhead. You're probably talking about more like 40, 50 years to be confident of generating the kind of local economic activity that will really pay off on an investment like that. But that's fine. I mean, if only we had an institution in society that was there to provide, to think for the long term, that had access to cheap capital, that was there to invest for the benefit of all people in the whole of society with a long-term perspective. I mean, if we had such an institution that could maybe take the lead here, we really wouldn't be having this debate. It'd be quite obvious.
Thank you very much, Toby. Ian, any thoughts your side on to Juliet's?
Yeah, I suppose I was just thinking about, we worked with London First a few years ago, just looking at the London housing market and the reason for the drag in delivery of units, and appreciate it's London. And we were seeing there was a huge drag between development receiving plan permission and actually starting on site. And, on quite a few occasions, they fell outside of the 5-year period, and we were looking at the reasons for that. Now there are a multitude of reasons for that, depending upon the size, the location. But one of the key issues we were seeing, particularly on the larger developments, was that there was the actual access and putting in place the finance lines that would allow these things to commence just simply wasn't there. It wasn't done early enough so that when the planning applications approved and all the 106 or whatever is signed, they could actually crack on with it. So I suppose that's one of the observations we saw, albeit in a London context. It was actually getting the finance in place early enough.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, got about 7 minutes left. Throw some quick individual questions out. Isabel Smith asks, how do we ensure that homes built garden communities are purchased by local residents who need housing and not commuters or second homeowners? She says this is a problem in Wales. Is there any which way in this, Toby?
Yeah, you simply, if that's your problem that you're trying to solve, then don't put them out on the open market. It's as simple as that. Leave them to a housing association, a community land trust, leave them to the local council. Again, you need an institution that can hold property for the long term and is actually motivated not just to take the highest price from whoever wants to pay it, but is motivated by the long-term health of that community. I would suggest if you're building new places, perfect opportunity to create obviously affordable housing, but also for private housing, put it in a community land trust. You can allow people, you can therefore put controls on who actually is allowed to buy those homes.
Thank you, Toby. Anyone else want to have?
Well, can I? Sometimes you can transform communities that are highly socially deprived by getting the mix right. There's something in it for the community, but also, the Otterpool example, it will bring wealth down from London into that community, who will eat out in restaurants and enjoy Folkestone as a place to be and enjoy, and the retail shops, and they'll employ people to build extensions on their houses, and the kids will all go to school, and it creates wealth, and it can turn, as long as you get the balance right between the two, you can turn some very, very challenging communities around by good planning and inviting new families to come and set up and build their lives around and be part of that new community. And so it works both ways.
Many thanks. Patrick Kennedy pitches in a question. He asks, is there a critical mass of population to deliver the services infrastructure, transport, and a decent supermarket (brackets Waitrose) and shopping precinct to justify development costs and to sustain, for example, a shopping precinct for the long term. Is there kind of any sort of baseline assessments anyone's looking at, Stephen or anyone?
Well, we did that at Kings Hill, actually, and it came out the sort of critical mass was getting to 15,000 homes and above to provide a sort of self-supporting community with supermarkets, schools, and a pub, and all of that stuff that makes community, and a sort of parish council and everything goes with it. But that work was done by Savills, and that's probably going back 12, 14 years ago, and we're now approaching the 15,000, I think, homes at Kings Hill. But that was the figure they came up with, and I sort of I don't disagree with their assessment that was published.
I mean, no, you know, I speak from a policy perspective rather than the planning perspective. There's no hard and fast rules, but as Paul said, it's partly about infrastructure, isn't it? So you look to multiples based around number of schools, etc. Is it a smaller place that doesn't have a secondary school? Is it a larger place that has one or more secondary schools? And that will tend to guide you. And we do see a bit of a sort of a clumping effect, I guess, around the sorts of sizes of place. But clearly it's all dependent on local circumstances. Just to very quickly jump back, I think, to Councillor Beasley's question, which we didn't quite get to, how to make it all work. I think getting in early, as some of the panel, just to reflect back on some of the views of the panelists in the session, getting in early and getting your sort of master plan right early to avoid some of that sort of leakage of land value is probably the trick. The earlier that you can get in and design it right from the start, the better shot that you have of probably achieving some of those objectives that Councillor Beasley is talking about.
Many thanks. I realise we're sort of running out of time, and just like the question of sport, mystery sportsmen around, there are always more questions than answers that we have got time to answer. Quick one perhaps for you, Stephen and Toby, from Simon Bowers, who quickly asks, is the government still interested in the planning freedoms agenda as set out by Tim Loynig, whereby a council invites offers of land meeting certain criteria to be optioned for modest uplift? Is that still on anyone's radar?
I mean, I don't know about the government, but I certainly hope not, because I have to say, while it sounds lovely on paper and in theory, in reality doesn't work like that. The reason we have a planning system is because it doesn't work like that. And the idea that you can somehow get a perfect kind of artificial auction situation created with 10 totally fungible and exchangeable sites, and therefore a low price doing that is just for the birds. It doesn't work, sadly.
Excellent. And so reaching kind of end of time now. So I'll invite colleagues with very, very short final comments, maybe 2 bullet points on what they see as most important going forward. Starting with Paul, if I may.
Well, I think, starting early and looking at the lessons to be learned from other garden communities that have worked and have had a difficult birth. What are those problems? What are the solutions to it? And obviously, much of that's been debated this morning about land assembly and control, and the fact that it's going to take a lot longer than you think, and the government is going to have to prime the pump, I think, with more money alongside the private investment to get these projects underway and give confidence to the market who will build and develop these programs, and build the infrastructure early as well. That's most essential. So I think it's lessons learned, and we've covered a lot of them today. But I will finish where I started. That I believe that new garden communities of variable size are the future and have an enormous amount to offer in solving the housing needs of this country.
Thank you very much, Paul. Stephen, very, very quickly, a quick few final comments from you, please.
Well, I think Sir Paul stole my thunder there. Getting in early, I think, is the trick. The government's role you know, I think in many ways and all things, you know, is here to sort of provide confidence and provide that support. You know, and you know, we sort of very much take that on board and keep that going forward. You know, I think we want to work with places. We want to see people coming forward. We've done a lot already, I think. But I think really it's just sort of take forward those conversations with places that want to grow, and as Paul said, encourage them to get in early.
Many thanks, Stephen. Toby, thanks for your fantastic contribution today. Any sort of final thoughts, comments from you, please?
There's only two things you need to make these garden communities really work. You need, as I mentioned before, it needs to be led by a body that has the long-term public interest at heart. That's its motivation. Right? And you need to be able to get the land cheap enough to make that realistic. And as Paul said, that means changing the compulsory purchase rules, not so that the state can go around compulsory purchasing lots of land, but just to shift the balance of incentives so that whoever the owner is knows that this site will actually deliver long-term public quality, affordability, and environmental sustainability. And if everyone knows that, and it's backed up with that big tool in the back pocket, then we can actually build some really great places.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Toby. Ian, final words over to you quickly, please.
Yeah, without repeating what the panelists have said, from a finance perspective, I think early engagement with the financial community is essential, because they will give a firm and external view on viability early doors, which really underpins their own credit assessments.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, our excellent panel, Ian, Paul, Toby, Stephen. We're going to call it a wrap now. Thank you so much for taking part today. Thanks so much for everyone who's attended in, who's thrown in questions and participated. We will send out a recording of today's session. For those whose questions we weren't able to answer, find us at the card list. So we know your names in any case, and we'll try and answer your questions to the best of our ability. So, sayonara, everyone. Thank you so much, and hope to see you at a future Building for Renewal webinar later in the year. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care now. Bye-bye.